Hello, welcome to the lecture series in political theory. Today, I'll be talking to you about Gramsci's idea of the state and hegemony. Antonio Gramsci, he was an Italian Marxist thinker. He was a contemporary of Lenin and Stalin. He was associated with the Socialist Party in Italy, and he became a prominent leader of the party by organizing militant trade union movements in Turin. The top leaders of the Socialist Party of Italy, they lacked dialectical understanding of Marxism. Gramsci, actually he differed with his own leadership, and he wanted a Leninist model of a party and a Soviet model of revolution in Italy. He was in close touch with the Soviet leaders. Taking note of the rise of fascism, Gramsci organized a revolutionary group that tried to unite all forces opposed to fascism. The Mussolini government arrested him in the year 1926, and he was in jail for about 17 years. In the prison, he began reflecting on why the socialist revolution was successful in Russia, but it failed in Italy. He penned his thoughts on political and economic history of Italy, the dynamics of state and civil society, and on the role of intellectuals and the significance of a proletarian party in the socialist revolution. He understood the consequences of uneven development of capitalism in Italy and advocated the need for unity between the working class in the more industrialized northern Italy and the peasant community in the agrarian southern Italy. Actually, his notes that he wrote in the prison were smuggled out of the prison, and it was published only after his death. Actually, his condition, medical condition, worsened in the prison, and he was taken to a clinic where he suffered a lot and died in the year 1937. It was only after his death that his friends compiled all his notes and brought it out in the form of the book, which is known to us today as the prison notebooks. The idea of hegemony is one of the key contributions of Gramsci. I will be talking about the idea of state and hegemony. But before that, let me give you some background as to why this concept becomes important. You know that Marx and Engels, when they were alive, they anticipated that the socialist revolution takes place first in advanced capitalist countries. Great Britain and France witnessed militant working class movements in 1840s. In the Paris Commune of 1871, the proletariat almost captured the state power. However, after the death of Marx and Engels, the proletarian movements did not advance the way that the Marxists anticipated. That resulted in confusion among the Marxists in Europe, leading to the birth of revisionist ideas of Bernstein and later Kautsky, who cast doubts on the relevance of Marxism in 20th century. It was at that point of time that Lenin came out with his theory of imperialism and claimed that in the changed national and international conditions, the proletarian revolution breaks out not in advanced capitalist countries, but in the countries where the imperialist chain is weak. He saw the possibility of a socialist revolution in Russia, although it was a weak capitalist country. He did not get carried away by the ideas of the then Marxists who continue to believe that the revolution breaks out only in the advanced capitalist countries. He thought that it is possible to have revolution in Russia despite its underdeveloped capitalist nature. It is because Russia was considered as one of the weakest links in the imperialist chain during the First World War time. And he also believed that there is a possibility of a revolution in two other countries, one Italy and the other one was Germany. The revolution no doubt succeeded in Russia, but it did not succeed in Italy and Germany. What are the causes for that? Yes, one can say that there was no leader like Lenin in Germany or Italy. But that was not the only cause. Gramsci's quest for understanding the causes for the failure of a socialist revolution in Italy led him to this theory of a state and hegemony. We start with his idea of state. He did not disown Leninist understanding of the state. You know, Lenin considered that the state is an oppressive organ, oppressive class organ, which comprises of institutions like army, police, bureaucracy, judiciary, prisons, etc. Gramsci did not say that Lenin was wrong. What he felt was that the Leninist understanding of the state is inadequate to explain political dynamics in more advanced capitalist countries which have powerful civil societies. According to him, the revolution in Russia became possible because there the state was everything and the civil society was weak. If you look at the history of the Russian Revolution, you can understand that there are two phases. In the first phase, which we call People's Democratic Revolution, there the purpose of the revolution was to dethrone the Tsar from power. And that was something which was accomplished in the February Revolution of 1917. After that, it was the Russian bourgeoisie led by Kerensky, his government, which came to power. Here, at that point of time, you can see that the defeated Tsar, neither the defeated Tsar nor the bourgeoisie, the Russian bourgeoisie which came to power just then, had any influence over the large sections of the people. Lenin and Bolshevik party took advantage of that. They mobilized not only the working class but also the peasantry and other laboring masses and led this revolution successfully and dethrone the bourgeoisie from power. But that was something not possible in countries like Italy. Because here, Gramsci says, state is only an outer ditch. Behind this state is a strong, powerful civil society, which continues to be under the influence of the dominant propertied classes. If I have to quote him, This is what Gramsci says. He says, in Russia, the state was everything. Civil society was primordial and gelatinous. In the West, there was a proper relationship between state and civil society. And when the state trembled, a sturdy structure of a civil society was at once revealed. The state was only an outer ditch, behind which there stood a powerful system of fortresses and earthworks. This is how Gramsci puts it. Gramsci contended that in countries like Italy, for the revolution to succeed, the proletariat should fight not only against the conventional oppressive state machinery, but it also has to deal with the civil society, which continues to be under the influence of the dominant propertied classes. To Gramsci, the state in advanced capitalist countries includes both political society and civil society. Political society, by political society he meant what Lenin said, oppressive organs, the amalgamation of different oppressive organs of the state. But alongside those organs, there is also the civil society. The state here is something like the Machiavellian centaur, a combination of the lion and fox. So he half human and half animal. Gramsci believes that there are two levels you can see dynamics operating simultaneously: force and of consent, authority and hegemony, violence and civilization, of the individual movement and of the universal movement, of agitation and of propaganda, of tactics and strategy, etc. So here, in the more advanced capitalist countries, the state does not use force for everything. In underdeveloped countries, you can directly see, you can identify that state means army ultimately, because you can see army directly taking over the control of all organs of the state, including the administration, and you can see it oppressing everyone opposed to it. But that is not something that happens in more civilized, liberal, democratic, capitalist countries. Here, the state is much more sophisticated. So, apart from force, it also uses other methods: persuasion, hegemony, and different kinds of tactics. According to Gramsci, the state in capitalist society does not remain a mere spectator. It actively involves itself in initiating necessary changes in the society that are required for the development of capitalism. In pursuit of this objective, the state acts as an ethical institution whose most important function, to put it in his own words, most important function is to raise the great mass of population to a particular cultural and moral level, a level which corresponds to the needs of the productive forces for development, and hence to the interest of the ruling classes. What does it mean? You just imagine that in a country the capitalists have come to power, but the people are still tribal or feudal in their outlook. They don't have education, they don't have technical expertise, and their orientation is not compatible with capitalism. Then will capitalism develop? It cannot. So what the state does is to bring necessary changes in the field of education, in the field of culture, and bring changes even in their moral orientations, and improve their productive capacities of the people in general, so that they will be able to work in the factories, in the mines, in the modern administrative institutions, and serve the new classes which came to power. And that is something which the state does. So it is in that sense the state acts as a kind of ethical institution as well. But the state does it, keep it in mind, that it does all that only to ensure that people reach that stage of development which is compatible with the interest of the bourgeoisie. So the modern state, while working for promoting the interests of the bourgeoisie, what it does is that it also projects them as the engine of national growth. And it works to mediate the interests of the bourgeoisie and other classes as well, and seeks to establish some kind of equilibrium between these contending classes, although this equilibrium may not be stable for long. So what it means that it doesn't just work for the capitalist class. It has to deal with other classes as well. It tries to bring some kind of parity, some kind of understanding between the two, and between the bourgeois class, which it projects as the national engine, you can say, and at the same time it wants to reconcile the contradiction between the bourgeoisie and other classes. So it is in that sense the modern state is not a mechanical groupings of certain organs. It is more than that. The modern state is actively engaged in organizing the hegemony of the directive and dominant group in the society. It tries to bring together all people everything under the hegemony of the dominant classes. So this becomes clear from what Gramsci himself says. This is a passage from his book, The Prison Notebooks. It is true that the state is seen as the organ of one particular group, destined to create favorable conditions for the latter's maximum expansion. But the development and expansion of the particular group are conceived of and presented as being the motor force of a universal expansion of a development of all national energies. In other words, the dominant group is coordinated concretely with the general interests of the subordinate groups, and the life of the state is conceived of as a continuous process of the formation and superseding of unstable equilibria between the interests of the fundamental group and those of the subordinate groups. So this is the task. This is something which cannot be done by the bourgeoisie themselves. It is the state which comes to mediate the interests of different classes in the larger interests of protecting and promoting the general interests of the dominant propertied classes. So here, in this whole process, the hegemony becomes an important attribute, essential for the modern state as well as for the ruling classes. What does Gramsci mean by hegemony? Hegemony basically refers to intellectual and moral leadership that the state or the dominant classes exercise over the civil society. The ruling classes, on its own strength and also through the state, ensure domination over the enemies and hegemony over the allies. You see the difference: domination over the enemies and hegemony over the allies. So when it comes to the enemies, it will use what we say the state in Leninist sense, the oppressive organs, to suppress any kind of opposition to them by those opposing classes. But simultaneously, it also uses hegemony, but against the subordinate classes, against its own allies. And Gramsci explains this this way: the supremacy of a social group manifests itself in two ways, as domination and as intellectual and moral leadership. A social group dominates antagonistic groups, which it tends to liquidate or subjugate, perhaps even by armed force. But it leads kindred and allied groups. So you use the oppressive organs to eliminate or liquidate your enemies, but you use intellectual and moral leadership, that is hegemony, over its own kindred or allied groups. This is what Gramsci says. You remember in my previous lecture on class struggle, party and the dictatorship of the proletariat, I spoke about 3 stages in the development of hegemonic class. Of course, that is the theory of Gramsci himself. In the first stage, which he calls it as economic corporate stage, the class exists only as an economic category, and it has at best what Lenin would call as trade union consciousness, maybe at the level of a factory. But in the second stage, the class becomes conscious of its economic and political interests and organizes itself as a class to fight for the general interests of the class as a whole. Here, the class becomes conscious of its interests, but class is thinking only of its own interests. 2. Gramsci, to come to power, this is not enough. He refers to the other stage, the final stage, which he calls it as hegemonic stage, where the class rises above its own economic corporate interests. And now it starts talking about issues on the universal plane and leads even other classes opposed to its own enemies. So this is the stage when the hegemonic class thinks not only about its own class interests, but it also thinks about other classes, other allied classes, and their class interests as well. So, unless a class rises to that stage, it will not be possible to capture and retain the state power. Gramsci puts it this way: a social group can and indeed must already exercise leadership before winning governmental power. It subsequently becomes dominant when it exercises power. But even if it holds it firmly in its grip or in its grasp, it must continue to lead as well. See, this is a very important thing, where Gramsci is telling that if any class wants to come to power, it should have hegemony over other classes as well, even before coming to power. Of course, when it comes to power, acquires the control of the state, it becomes all the more powerful. But even at that stage, the class should continue to exercise its hegemony over other classes. Remember, this is what I said when I was discussing about the dictatorship of the proletariat. It is not enough just to come to power, and even after coming to power, the proletarian state or the party should continue to have hold over other classes. Otherwise, there is a possibility of reversal, a counter-revolution. And Gramsci is putting it in more general terms. And this is something true for the bourgeoisie and also true for the proletariat if it aspires to come to power. So here, how does this hegemony works? Hegemony requires that the people voluntarily accepts and submits and accept to be led by a more powerful class in its fight against its own enemies. Here, how does this hegemony is achieved? The dominant classes do not exercise its power only ideologically. It is not merely with ideology that you control or you lead other classes. Gramsci says that to win over the confidence of other classes and to become hegemonic, the aspiring class must be willing to compromise its immediate economic interests in the larger general interests of the class as a whole. This is how Gramsci puts it. Hegemony presupposes that account be taken of the interests and tendencies of the groups over which hegemony is to be exercised, and that a certain compromise equilibrium should be formed. In other words, that the leading group should make sacrifices of an economic corporate kind. But there is also no doubt that such sacrifices, such a compromise cannot touch the essential. For the hegemony is ethical, political. It must also be economic, must necessarily be based on the decisive function exercised by the leading group in the decisive nucleus of economic activity. A very long passage, may be difficult to understand. At the end of the lecture, I'm placing all the quotations so you can go through them. But what in this passage Gramsci is saying is that if you want to be a hegemonic class and lead other classes as well in your fight against the enemies, it is necessary that you have to compromise your economic interest to some extent. You have to address to the needs and expectations of other classes as well. So you have to compromise and yield certain things so that you satisfy other classes and that the other classes consider you as your friend and guide. But he also says at the same time, he reminds us when you say compromises, it is not compromise to the extent that my own interests are forgotten and I only take care of others' interests. No. Gramsci says that here the hegemony is not mere ethical issues, it is also economic. You sacrifice, you compromise to the extent your own interests demand. To a particular point, you make concessions in order to keep everyone happy and under your hegemonic influence. But see to it, your general interests are not affected. If you understand this, you will be this passage. You will also be able to understand why the capitalist state takes up many kinds of welfare and developmental policies which benefit other classes, classes other than the bourgeoisie. Okay. Now, here he says Gramsci actually refers to two conditions which are required for extension of a hegemony. The first one is that the hegemonic class takes into consideration the interests of the subordinate classes and makes some economic concessions to win over them. This I have already told you. The second one, and this hegemony is achieved also through the efforts of the state and the media, which projects the bourgeoisie in a very positive way. And they enjoy such a prestige in the society, they enjoy such an enormous prestige within the society that the people voluntarily look towards them to guide them. So here the second one talks about the enormous prestige that the hegemonic class enjoys in the society due to its superior economic position and also because of its role in the society. So these two things go together, which making the other people belonging to other classes accepting the hegemony of the dominant class. So this is thing, if you understood this theory of Gramsci, it will it is something which tells us about how the capitalist state or the bourgeoisie operate, but it also indicates what the proletariat should do if it aspires to come to power. So here he is indicating that unless and until the proletariat emerges as a hegemonic class capable of influencing and carrying ahead other subordinate classes opposite to capitalism, one cannot have socialist revolution in the more advanced capitalist countries with powerful civil societies. So here it is not enough that the proletariat have arms and with the arms it can defeat the capitalist state machinery and acquires power. Before you take up arms, the proletariat should be able to have achieved this hegemonic status within the society. Before achieving that hegemonic status, taking up arms is actually detrimental and counterproductive. and that is something which some of the, you can say, the so-called Maoist factions in India should learn and should be aware of that. So this is the sum and substance of Gramsci's theory of state and hegemony. Hope you understood. I request you to note that at the end of this video lectures, these slides of certain passages from Gramsci's notebook, which I have read out, are also given. Please go through them. In the next lecture, I will be focusing on Gramsci's ideas on intellectuals and the party. Till then, goodbye and thank you.